All right. Well, I guess we're live. We are sadly still missing our intro video, but hopefully we'll get that in the near future. Nothing like a little, couple of technical difficulties to start off our day. Well, welcome to Cube by Example Insider, where we talk to people who are directly involved in the creation and kind of continuation of Kubernetes and all the ancillary projects that go along with it. As you can imagine, Kubernetes is a large, complex project, and even things that aren't directly underneath the kind of umbrella of Kubernetes are still very much involved in the ecosystem. And so we like to, and because it's an open source project, we like to talk to participants in the community who are actually contributing work to the community, because we feel like it gives us a better sense of where the kind of ecosystem is going, which you would normally get from like a roadmap event or something from a proprietary company. We feel like the actually talking to the people who should do the work makes a big difference. So I'm Langdon White. I am a clinical faculty member at Boston University, formerly at Red Hat, and I will kind of go around and just introduce Avita. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Avita Raghunathan. I am a senior software engineer at Red Hat working on data protection. I was here as a guest on the episode number 5, and I love the show so much. And I got this opportunity to be here as a co-host today, and I am excited to talk to Travis about Rook and more exciting stuff around storage. I'm a big fan, so it's an honor to be here with both of you and in the community. Moving on to Travis, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, hello. Travis Nielsen. Happy to be here to talk about Rook. Rook is what I do for my life, so I'm always amazed how many people want to hear about it and learn more. But yeah, I'm one of the original founders of the Rook project, and that's really where I got into Kubernetes and that whole ecosystem. So it's been a great journey. It started about 6 years ago, and before that I was at a startup called SimForum doing distributed storage, and before that Microsoft. So I've been in the storage area for most of my career, and yep, that's me in a nutshell.
So Rook brought you to open source. Brought you to Kubernetes, but what brought you to open source? Like, were you involved in open source before that work?
No, it's really the same project. We at the startup I was with SimForum, we thought about, well, should we open source what we were working on? It never really worked out while we were on that project, but then as we got into the next things, which basically turned into Rook, that's where we really got into open source and followed a lot of patterns that we saw in the Kubernetes ecosystem.
About how to like do a successful kind of open source project, you mean?
Yeah, and I guess maybe it's too long ago to remember now exactly how we got into it, but it felt like, yeah, as we got into the open source world, we just looked at, well, how are other projects doing it? How do we do releases? How do we do even things like rebasing and PRs and dealing with Git? We wanted to make sure we were following patterns other people were using. So I think Kubernetes was one of those projects we were looking at early on, just to make sure, since it's such a big ecosystem. Well, right. If you're not doing things how they're doing it, then maybe we're not doing it right.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Rook has been successful, so thanks for sharing that little bit about like how we look up in the community, we take the good portion of it and how to create a successful project. And it is the first graduated cloud native storage project in the CNCF community. So how do you feel about that? Like, can you share us a little bit more on the success stories and like, more background on that?
Yeah, great. it has been a nice journey, and to become a graduated project. It's already been, I think, has it been 3 years since we were graduated? I think 2020. No, wait, it's only 22. A couple of years since we've been graduated. Um, but yeah, how this journey worked is, so maybe I'll just go back in the history a bit. So back in 2016, when the Rook project started, that's when we started to really wanted to look at, well, what's cloud native storage? What does storage mean in the cloud native world? Cloud native was kind of the latest buzzword back in that time, where really you want your software to work in the cloud. You want it to work well in the cloud, be designed for the cloud. And we wanted to see, well, storage is, we know, is important for the world, and storage is a really hard problem. We want to make it work well for people. So originally we looked at Ceph as the storage project that we would build on, and quickly learned that, or in retrospect, it's definitely a good thing, and it's been a great thing to build on Ceph as the storage platform. But Ceph wasn't built for cloud native; it wasn't built for Kubernetes, and so we thought, well, we need to bring this storage platform that's been stable for years already, bring it into the cloud native and Kubernetes ecosystem. So initially, we were thinking, well, let's make it work well for any cloud native environment, whether or not it's Kubernetes or not. Well, initially we didn't even start with Kubernetes. We thought, oh, we're going to build kind of our own um, installation system for this distributed system. And we quickly realized, well, if we just build on etcd and try and use all those primitives, it's just going to be too complicated. Why would we do that if Kubernetes is already doing all of that for us? So that's when we really took a bet on Kubernetes and said, hey, this is the platform for distributed systems. Let's build the storage platform on Kubernetes, since it gives us that distributed platform for free, essentially. And then, yeah, from there, it's like we created an operator, and I think around 2006, yeah, that first conference in 2016, also, we went to the Seattle KubeCon, and there were maybe 1,000 people there. So, you know how big KubeCon is now, 10,000 people or whatever. It's grown a bit. So it was still pretty small. The concepts were new. And at that conference is where I believe Brandon Phillips presented on operators and the operator pattern with etcd and the Prometheus operators as the first two examples. And while we were there, we heard that and we thought, wait, that's exactly what we want to do. We want an operator that's going to automate storage and bring Ceph to Kubernetes. So then, yeah, we immediately kind of pivoted and said, yep, we're creating an operator. We're going to create CRDs. Well, they weren't called CRDs back then. They were TPRs. That's how old the project is. But so we created an operator, and then soon after that, the Kubernetes community came up with this whole project or pattern for graduating, moving from sandbox to incubating to graduating. And so we thought, okay, we want this for the community. We're open source, just like it's expected in this community to progress. So we worked through that. We worked through that whole progression, and we're happy that the community was receptive of the project. We got some feedback along the way for how we could make the project even more useful for the community. And so it's just been great to see the reception then for, there's the Ceph community that already existed. Then any of them who were using Kubernetes said, oh yeah, well, Rook's obviously the solution for us. So we naturally had the Ceph community join us. And then actually somewhere in there, I joined the Ceph team at Red Hat to more naturally work together and make sure we were building the right thing. And then I think graduation a couple of years ago was final stamp of approval where it's like, yep, the community really sees the value in this. There's good production deployments, lots of testimonies of people happy to use it, and that it's open community. We want to do the right thing for everyone. We're not trying to favor any one company, because there are maintainers for multiple companies, and all of that goodness that comes with the open source world. And I don't know, I kind of went in a lot of directions there, but
I actually, you
it's
said
been a good
something
journey.
particularly interesting there. I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, you said, one of the things that you were struggling, or like you and your team were struggling with early on, was what does it mean to be cloud native storage? Can you tell me what some of the hallmarks of that you think are of cloud native storage? Like what is different about it? I mean, I have my own theories, but I'd be really curious to know what made you gravitate towards that, or how did you decide to solve that, or how do I recognize it?
Yeah, let me try and think back that far. So when we think of traditional storage, it's like an appliance. You buy it, you plug it in, and you connect your external storage to it. And that's usually how, or it's still a common pattern with Kubernetes today, where to get storage with Kubernetes, you've got your storage classes, which let you basically attach the storage, whether it's inside or outside Kubernetes. The cloud provider plugs in their storage. If you have an appliance from Netapp or wherever, you plug in that storage. And but how do you get storage that to be managed by the same cluster, the Kubernetes cluster, where you're already managing other applications, right? We don't want it to be external. We want it to be just native to the platform. And that was I guess that was the basic assumption, was like, we don't want it to be external. We want it to be part of the same cluster you're already managing. And then with that comes all the patterns that Kubernetes has. Well, you're going to be running in containers. Which traditionally, really, Ceph hadn't been running in containers, although it was moving in that direction already. You've got the concepts of your running applications, your pods being able to move between nodes, because Kubernetes just assumes nodes can go down and you can move to other nodes, and just kind of naturally deal with the dynamic environment where things go up and go down, and you replace nodes, and nothing is static anymore, really. So all of that, just kind of being able to handle that dynamic distributed environment and be part of the same cluster as the rest of the distributed app platform. In my mind, that's kind of what it means to bring storage to the cloud native world.
And so, do you think things like eventual consistency are kind of in line with the cloud nativeness, or do you think they're, a way kind of around some of those problems, or is that, or just anathema altogether? I'm just kind of curious of your thoughts on, because it's definitely growing in popularity, and to me, it seems like something that if you're kind of a true storage person, you might be really stressed out about.
About the eventual consistency nature of it, or
Yeah.
Yeah, and Ceph itself kind of has some assumptions that, well, it's not eventually consistent. It's fully consistent. Like, once you put data in to Ceph, you know that it's replicated, and kind of that Ceph is taking care of it. The difference being, well, if it's eventually consistent, then you put it in and you might not get it back if you ask for it too soon, right? Because the backend is replicating the data, and until it's replicated, then you might not get it back. But Ceph, yeah, we liked the full consistency of Ceph for a data platform. And so there's a little trade-off there, which is maybe it takes a touch longer to commit your data. Well, I mean, we're talking milliseconds, right? But that full consistency has been, yeah, we just really like that that solution from Ceph, having the full consistency.
That makes sense. I was just kind of curious, if there's, it seems like we're maybe getting to a point where we can do full consistency most of the time, if not all of the time. So maybe it's not, maybe it was a stopgap, right? That's why I was kind of curious what your kind of feeling on it was. Savita, did you have a question?
So I don't have a question. I just wanted to say something on top of what Travis said before. Like I used to be a cluster administrator, so what I would look for in a cluster storage is always baffling. It's still baffling to me, and I'm trying to learn a little bit. I am improving on my knowledge. I wouldn't say like I know everything about storage or cloud native storage for the matter. The one amazing thing about Rook, I would say, is that it has those things like how Kubernetes is self-healing. The Rook storage operator says like it's self-healing. So it gives me peace of mind, like I don't have to know about everything. I just need to know about some basics and I can still do my job and keep on improving my knowledge on the side. It's an amazing win, to be honest. So when you told about like how you made it work with Kubernetes and everything, it's it's amazing. I'm a fan, and it's uh it's it's marvelous in my head. Like I just see software as like things. It's a beautiful piece of software. So I just wanted to add that.
That's great to hear. And yeah, I'd like to talk to that point too, really, because what we really saw as potential in Kubernetes as the patterns there, the basic pattern is you need to declare desired state. Like how do you want the software to behave? That's what you're telling Kubernetes with these manifests, these YAML files, whatever. You tell the platform what your settings are, what your desired state is, and the operator's job is to go make that happen, to make sure that um, that your applications are running reliably. So in the case of Rook, that means the Rook operator is going to be making sure that the pods are all running where they need to run, that um, that your cluster topology is handled, that the data is safe and replicated, that if something goes down, that we try and start up a replacement somewhere else because there's that flexibility there, and that operator has an amazing power to go make sure that things stay healthy automatically. And so that's definitely been a fundamental design principle of Kubernetes that has really worked well for Rook.
Yeah. So, although you kind of, Savita, I think you raise a good point. Like, I guess my question with something like Rook is like, is that where I should start in a sense, or do I start with something like Ceph if I want to try to figure out how to do storage? Let's say in a in a development environment, right, rather than necessarily a production environment, where I'm kind of trying to understand how I want my storage eventually to work. What's the best way to kind of get started with it? Is do I do I start at Rook? Do I start at NFS? Do I start at Ceph? Do I start where do I kind of get plugged into understanding how doing the storage inside Kubernetes? Like, where's the best point to kind of start for you, in your opinion?
Sorry, that question was Savitha or for me?
Oh, for you, I meant Travis. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, really, with Ceph, there are two very different environments to run it in. One is Kubernetes, and with Rook, and one is doing it on your own bare metal, where there's just no Kubernetes platform available. So, upstream and kind of for downstream solutions, those two scenarios really remain both important and critical because some people just aren't on Kubernetes yet. More and more people are moving there, but for people who are already running Kubernetes, if they want storage, then I'd recommend you to get started with Rook to deploy Ceph, because Rook just makes it. Excuse me. Rook just naturally deploys Ceph. It makes Ceph easier to deploy and manage and upgrade and all of that. So it's certainly possible to deploy Ceph without Rook, but not really in a Kubernetes environment. So in Rook, we have documentation on our link from our website on rook.io, where you can go there. There's a quick start guide. This is how you get started with Kubernetes and deploying Ceph. And we try and make it as clear as possible. I know it's still, storage is still a difficult thing. There's no easy way to do it really, and it takes a bit of dedication to get it going. But it's once people get it going, then I feel like they really say, hey, this does work nicely. It works well for us and solves our storage problems really.
Cool. I just threw a link to what I hope is the getting started for the quick start in the chat for people to take a look.
Yes.
And also on Kube example, you actually have a series, right?
That's right.
With introduction to Rook self in the once I find the right window as well. So either one of those might be a good start as well. So I hear through the grapevine that the origin story of the name Rook is a good story, and so I'm curious to know what that story is because I don't think I know it.
Let's jump to that. I have heard about it, but I want to hear about it again from one of the co-founders of Rook. So
great. Yeah. As with any project, anything, naming is kind of a big question. Well, what do we call this thing, right? We're creating something new. Do we just call it Ceph for Kubernetes? Do we, what do we call it? And well, initially it wasn't even Ceph for Kubernetes. It was for cloud native. Anyway, our initial code name for the project was Castle. And where Castle came from is we wanted to build, you want to build something, build a place that's safe for something that's important to you that you want to protect. So a castle, you're protecting your people, you're protecting the king, you've got soldiers surrounding it. It's a safe place that's built with rock and stone. It's a safe place. So Castle was the original name of the project, but then as it came time to kind of look at copyrights and what other projects out there called Castle, there were a couple other projects called Castle. So we thought, well, we kind of like our logo that looks like a castle. We like this whole theme. What do we do? Well, so then we came up with Rook as it's of course the piece in the game of chess, which is a castle, and I think in Arabic it's Rook is the word for castle. It's a nice short word. Rook.io was available, and we thought, oh great, let's go with this, and it's been good ever since. I've got it on my license plate on my car now, and it's
Awesome.
It's just a nice short word that everybody can relate to from the game of chess. And
to be honest, I can't believe Rook.io was available. To be honest, right? Like, I mean, right. It is a pretty common, pretty solid word, so I'm impressed you were able to get the domain. But I'm actually familiar. Isn't there like I want to say it's a PHP web framework called Castle, I think, which was probably or something like that. It's been a while, but I used to.
Yeah, maybe that was it. I can't remember. Someone had a trademark on it too, so we couldn't use Castle.
Nice. That's cool.
and
sorry, go ahead.
I should give kudos to someone who designed the logo too. It's one of the best project logos that I've seen, which I wouldn't mind putting it on my computer or like even sporting it outside. So kudos to whoever the designer was, or
Yeah, we had a great designer on the team at the time, and actually he's moved on with one of the other Rook founders to the Upbound project. So if you've heard of Upbound, look at their designs. Yeah, I love their designs too. So shout out to him for creating the Rook logo.
Yeah, it's always handy. Yeah, and the naming of things, I completely agree. I was involved in the naming of modularity, which led to rel app streams. Modularity was a terrible name, and but it was one of those ones where we kind of started throwing it around and it stuck, rather than putting real effort into naming. I strongly recommend, if you're ever building a project, put some effort into either coming up with a good name or an arbitrary name. But an arbitrary name is often even less risky, because that also lets you pivot and do things like that. But yeah, totally. Savita, did you have another question you wanted to move on to, or?
Sure, yeah. I have like many questions, but
Okay.
I'm just gonna go on a tangent and ask like, tell us a little bit more about how to contribute to Rook, or like some folks are interested in like getting started somewhere. I know Langdon had shared some intro links to intro videos and like where to get started. But say I'm a newbie. I want to like learn. I come, I try it out. Hey, there is this thing that I want to improve on, and I want to like start contributing back. So like, can you share what's the path like for folks who want to like start contributing to the project?
Yeah, great. And I mean, first of all, we love contributors. We try to foster an environment where everybody's welcome to ask questions and contribute back to the community, whether it's with PRs or with just answering other people's questions that come too. Um, we want an environment where people feel welcome and that their questions will be answered. So yeah, on rook.io, like we've already linked, there's the documentation for getting started. There's also a link there to join the Rook Slack. So in the Rook Slack, it's where really it's intended to be a place where you can ask questions, get answers, um, and community members can answer each other's questions. I am frequently on that Slack as well, answering a lot of the questions. But it's just nice to see, uh, continually, wow, look at all these different people asking questions, um, all the people getting involved in trying out Rook. And then, so the Rook Slack is important. There's in the getting started guide and in our documentation, we have a doc that's about how to contribute to Rook. So if you really want to contribute some code back, let's see, how do I paste a link in there? Let's see where to paste it. But there's in the documentation, if you click on the contributing tab,
I can find
we have a whole have a whole topic there on here's how you set up your GitHub, how you open a PR, and all these little things for how do you get started as a contributor there. For people who really want to get into the contributing and the coding, I'll just point out testing is an important thing for us so that we make sure we keep a reliable platform. We've got CI that runs all of our tests, and we really like to make sure things stay stable for every release. And so if someone comes and contributes, we just make sure every contribution is solid and works for the community. But definitely welcome to those contributions. There's GitHub. GitHub is our main place for opening issues. If you find an issue, want to report an issue, or there's also discussions tab in GitHub, and then of course opening a PR if you have a code or documentation suggestion there.
So we actually had a question from the audience too. I think I found the link, so I'm going to post that real quick. And then, but we did have a question from the audience was, what is Rook's relationship to databases? Does Rook help me, deploy Postgres or whatever in Kubernetes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe I'll talk about Ceph for a minute first as the data platform and how it then works with your applications like databases on top of the storage. So Ceph provides really three types of data storage. It provides block storage, uh, shared file system, and object store. So let me talk about each of those. So block storage is usually where you have an application that needs to create a volume, provision a volume, and that only that one pod is going to use that volume. So in Kubernetes, it's a read write once volume generally. Then shared file system storage with Cephfs. That's where, well, you might have a pod that wants to share its storage with other pods. So you've got a read write many volume. And so Ceph allows that. So sharing storage between pods is completely possible with that. And then the third form, object storage, is all about kind of what you think of as Amazon S3, which initially created object storage, where you're putting and getting objects into the storage platform. So Ceph provides all three of those, and you can choose which ones you want to enable, all three of them or just one of them, depending on your storage needs. But so databases now, like Postgres, Cassandra, or any of those, typically databases would be created on top of the block storage. So you create your read write once, PVC, provision the volume, and then you would write to that. Your database would then write to that volume, that Ceph volume, just like it would write to any other volume that you might provision. So I hope that gives an overview there.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying, you kind of like you set up the storage with Rook and Ceph as block storage, right? And then you would kind of install your database normally. And it's just that it would be kind of getting its storage through this kind of automatically replicating or distributed files, well, block store, to be specific. Is that a fair recap?
Yeah, that's right. And another example, I guess, if you're running in AWS, your database might be backed by an EBS volume, or I mean, if you're not running in AWS, you're running somewhere else where if you're in your own data center where you've configured Rook, then you'd just be putting it on top of a Ceph block storage volume instead of the EBS volume.
Right. Okay. So Venten, who is the person who asked the question, feel free to add follow-ups if you have any more questions. What I would like to kind of move on to is, kind of as we talk about with the Insider show, right? We talk about kind of what's coming, right? So what are you most excited about from a kind of a feature perspective or improvement? Maybe it's stability, maybe it's something else, that's coming in, say, I don't know, the next 6 months or so about Rook and or even about Ceph, right? Like, storage available to Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have several engineers working on Rook full time. So there's always improvements. There's always something coming. And maybe I'll talk to our release cycle just briefly. So every about 3 or 4 months, we kind of try to follow the Kubernetes release cycle, which is about, I think it's 3 times a year now. Every 4 months is the goal. So we're about on the same schedule that we'll have a release. Our next one will be coming up in August. It's planned for Rook version 1.10. So and really where Rook is feature wise, I feel like I'm just happy I feel like it's stable. We've got the basic feature set. Now we're still improving. We're still adding features, but the basic things are all there. Like one feature we're looking at for 1.10 is the ability to say, it's kind of at the Ceph level, to be able to say, keep track of who ran what command, like what's the operator doing versus what is a user or admin doing to manage Ceph in what we call the toolbox. The toolbox is this pod that we make it so you can run Ceph commands if you know what you're doing with Ceph, you can go run those commands there. So it kind of making it better at the logging level so we know what's happening. We can keep track of that. I mean, there's already logs. It's just we can't tell who's doing it if we're looking back at logs. So maybe that's one internal feature that I'm excited about that most people probably wouldn't even notice. But there's that. Other features we did recently add an NFS driver to Rook, and it's a CSI driver, so that people who have legacy applications that use NFS and they want to kind of come into the Kubernetes world and convert to Kubernetes, then we've got this NFS driver that makes it so you can connect your storage with NFS. That's the external storage, and then kind of convert it into Rook storage, so that you can get away from that NFS storage and convert it into Ceph. So that's another big feature area that someone else on my team has been working on. Happy to have that one. And there's always so much going on with the project. I'm going to forget them on the spot, but that's a couple of ideas for things coming.
Those sound pretty cool.
I think the NFS bit, it's going to be a music to so many people, because they, like large companies, many of them have their on-premises data centers still, even though they use cloud, and predominantly for the on-prem, they would be reliant on NFS. Most of them use NFS. So yeah, it would be like amazing for them to even adopt Kubernetes at a faster rate, than what they planned. So that's cool to hear. And wow, and until you mentioned, I only thought that it's gonna work with Ceph and whatever Ceph supports, the block, the object, and I forgot the other one so fast. When I have it, I just cannot say it out loud.
Shared file system. Yeah.
Shared file. Thank you. So I didn't know about the NFS. So thank you for mentioning that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we always look forward to community feedback as well, to say what features do people want to see. Yeah, there's always those feature requests coming in that we're happy to entertain. And sometimes we say, yes, that's a great idea. And sometimes we say, well, do you have the bandwidth to work on that? Because sometimes we just don't have the bandwidth, as with any software project, I think.
Yeah, kind of getting to that. So you said your release schedule is, 3 times a year. Is, particularly with storage, right? That's something that tends to be, both jokingly and seriously, it should be pretty stable. How does the user base feel about that kind of release schedule? Is it, or how do you manage to the fact that, the thing that I don't want changing in my environment is the storage, right? Because I want it to always be there, and I want it to never go away. What's the, how does Rook and Ceph deal with that, those updates?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one thing I want to maybe talk about now is, so the difference between Rook and Ceph, because they each have their own responsibilities. So Rook's responsibility is really to provide the management of Ceph. So I talk about the Rook schedule as, okay, how often are we releasing so that you can get improvements to the management layer, right? But you can separately decide which version of Ceph you want to be running in Rook. So you tell Rook, okay, I want Ceph, version 16.2.10. That's the latest version of stable Ceph, or 17.2.2, depending on which major version you're on. So you can decide which different version of Ceph you want to run, and you can decide to update Ceph much less often, because Ceph is the data layer. You really want to be careful with what you're doing with that data layer. You don't want it to go down. Yeah, you want it to be super stable. And you want to be really mindful of when you're updating that data layer. And this is kind of thinking about architecture in retrospect. Like 3 years ago, one of the major changes we made was decoupling that Ceph version from Rook, because originally in the project, we basically embedded the latest version of Ceph with Rook, and you couldn't choose what version of Ceph you deployed. And so we kind of would, we would force that data layer upgrade whenever we upgraded Rook, and we realized, that's people really do need that mind, that peace of mind that they're getting a stable data layer. And so we separated it. We said, okay, you can choose your version of Ceph that we deploy with the Ceph daemons in those pods, and Rook will have its own version with the Rook operator, basically. So that since those are fully separate now, Ceph has its major releases once a year, and Rook's is 3 times a year. So if you don't want to upgrade the Ceph layer as often, then you can choose to do that. You probably should do it the latest, upgrading to the latest patch release of Ceph is a good idea anytime it comes out, generally. But then you can choose when you're ready to make that jump to the major upgrade of Ceph, which Rook usually makes pretty smooth because our goal is to make Ceph deployment and upgrades simple and automated. But you just need to be aware of when you're upgrading, so you can be ready in case something happens.
We had a couple more good questions from the audience. One that I think is relatively straightforward, which is, does Rook work with OKD and Openshift? And I would say yes, and just look to Travis for confirmation, but I can't imagine why it wouldn't.
Yes, absolutely. Rook runs anywhere Kubernetes runs, and people. The most common scenario I would say is that Rook would be running in a bare metal cluster where you don't have other storage options available. But at the same time, there are a number of scenarios where people use Rook in cloud providers where their other storage options are there with the cloud provider storage, like AWS or Google Cloud or whatever. And so it runs everywhere. And in cloud scenarios, the main difference that really benefits Rook users too is that you can tell Rook to back the Ceph storage by the cloud native storage. So if you're in AWS, you can say, oh, back Ceph by EBS volumes. And now the limitations of EBS can be overcome by Ceph, because now, for example, EBS volumes are limited to an AZ, and you can only have so many volumes mounted on per node, like 30. Last I heard, that might be out of date though. Some limitations like that. But now with Ceph on top of that, you can have storage across AZs. There's virtually no limit to how many volumes you can have. You get the benefits of large EBS volumes, but you can have small volumes with Ceph since it's all thinly provisioned. And anyway, so there are lots of benefits to that as well.
So yeah, I think
from the original question there. So
no, I thought it was good. I was just kind of like, I wanted to also kind of make the point that OpenShift, OKD are really like an open source vendorized version of Kubernetes, right? I mean, so at the end of the day, it's still Kubernetes underneath. So as a result, anything that works with Kubernetes should work with OpenShift and OKD, including Rook. But then we just got a whole influx of people. Welcome to the Brazilian people from Linux Tips Brazil. But what I wanted to also ask is, there was a question also from the audience, which was, does Rook work with other storage providers like Netapp? And again, I think this is hopefully a straightforward answer. But
yeah, I mean, if you have a Netapp, you're probably going to use with Kubernetes a storage class that consumes that Netapp storage, and so Rook probably wouldn't be involved there. If you could also choose to back Rook by some other storage, as long as there's a storage class, Rook can consume that storage behind it. I'm not sure I've heard of someone using Netapp in conjunction with Rook and Ceph. Usually I would say they're in parallel, or you can have Netapp as well as Rook.
So it's a little bit of both and, right? Or and or depending on your perspective, what you're trying to accomplish, and I think we were talking about this a little bit on the the chat of like, databases often offer replication, right? But then storage, particularly these days, right, distributed storage also offers replication, and depending on your use case, depending on what you already have set up or whatever, like you want to choose one or the other. What you don't usually want to choose is trying to have them like fight, right? You don't really want database doing replication and your storage doing replication, because often that will go poorly, because one gets confused about who's responsible for what. I think the same kind of thing happens potentially with something like Netapp or whoever your storage provider is, where it's like, make sure it's very clear to all the software involved who's responsible for which bits, right? And you get into trouble when you try to kind of just take all the defaults from everybody without really thinking about how much they potentially overlap. Would you largely agree? I think that's the problems I've run into the most.
Yeah, exactly. You can have multiple solutions that they can overlap. I mean, not in responsibility, but yeah, they're independent. I was going to say something else, but lost that thought. Anyway.
Well, maybe we can come back to it. We had another question, which was kind of, I think interesting, which is basically like, does Rook with Ceph support the concept of like a data lake versus, traditional storage in a sense?
Right. And I know I've heard the term data lake, but I'm trying to think how it fits in with Ceph. When you think of a data lake, like what, can you expand on that scenario a bit?
So for me, like a data lake is kind of like an even less well-defined data warehouse. So in other words, in my opinion, right, this is where again, you would be using some sort of software that is doing the data lake. Like the one I've been investigating lately that I haven't read that much about, it's called Delta Lake, I think. So kind of, again, it has a responsibility of managing that lake. And so what you don't want to do is have Rook and Ceph try to manage the lake. On the flip side, the lake itself could be managed by a Delta on top of something like Ceph. And then you kind of could expose it through your kind of Kubernetes environment. But this is where it gets a little dicey about like, this is one, it's very specific to the scenario that you actually want to deploy. And so kind of giving a general answer is tough. Ceph is storage, so you can run your lake on the storage, or you can try to build a lake, using like Rook and Ceph. The problem is you're not going to get what you get out of something like Delta Lake, the feature set there. So
Right. And what I'd
that's my
say is,
opinion.
Rook is really targeted at managing storage for a single Kubernetes cluster. So if the lake
Mhm.
were to try and span Kubernetes clusters, that's not so much a thing for Ceph. Although I will point out that Ceph and Rook helps provide the features where you can mirror data across clusters. So if you have your block, if it's Ceph RBD volumes, you can mirror them to the other cluster. And so whichever type of volume, you can mirror it to the other cluster and get DR. So there's documentation how you set up DR and get failover and things as well across clusters.
Is
So
multi-cluster
that's a whole big
support for
topic.
Rook on the kind of roadmap, or is that, or do you think that the kind of current solution doing it with Ceph is the right answer in a sense, or at least from what you know today, right? The right answer.
Yeah, and as of today, I'd say Rook upstream is really just targeted a single cluster. If you have multiple clusters, you're just going to be having multiple Rooks, and you could configure each Rook to mirror if you want to mirror the data across. But ultimately, yeah, we don't really have something in mind for multi-cluster support. I think for for downstream, I know Red Hat has like this ACM project that's for managing multiple clusters. So I'd say it's more of a downstream thing in my mind, or at least not a Rook problem we're trying to address.
Yeah, this is actually one of the challenges I think with kind of the multi-cluster management in general with Kubernetes is like from a operator perspective, single pane of glass into all of the things you're kind of managing is nice, but I'm not sure that all the things that you're managing need to be aware of each other. So in other words, you might have 67 rooks as long as, from an operator perspective, and sorry, when I say operator, I mean human operator. From an operator perspective, I want to know about the 67, but I don't necessarily need them to literally be just one that is being managed on its own. Instead, give me a kind of user interface that lets me say, this is how I want Rook to operate in all 67, or I want Rook to operate in this way for 60 of them and set, another way for 7. But that's kind of that they're not operating as a cluster. They're being individually managed at a kind of a step back level. I know this is one of the, before I left Red Hat, actually, ACM was starting to come up. And it's one of those difficult problems of like who owns which part.
Yeah, and what I'd say about if you have lots of clusters, probably you're going to be automating things, scripting things, so you get consistent configurations across clusters. Because Rook is all based on the YAML manifests. We've got Helm charts as well for people who like to use Helm. So those would allow automation across clusters for sure. And then to monitor what's happening in the clusters, there's a lot of functionality around the Prometheus monitoring, so you can collect metrics, you can see dashboards about how Ceph is behaving in the cluster and things like that. So you can get insight for sure with those other tools like Prometheus and Grafana, which a lot of people really appreciate. Ceph also has a dashboard that you can connect to the individual cluster and see more details for what Ceph is doing.
So I wanted to pause there because we are almost out of time. We do have a number of other questions in the chat. So I'm going to put the Kubernetes by example forums in the chat. So please go open a topic there or, anything that you're interested in, and we'll try to, make sure to come back and take a look, and respond to any more questions that you might have. I also would like to pitch an upcoming conference that is all about open source development, and it is called devconf.us. There is an analog in CZ, which is actually quite a bit bigger, in the Czech Republic, but that is in January, and this is actually next month, about the middle of August. And so I want to say we actually have at least one Rook talk there, but I could be crazy. I'm trying to remember. Even though I'm a co-chair, there's enough talks that I can't remember them all. So definitely check that out. It's in Boston. We're going to be doing some streaming of it, but it is meant to be an in-person conference. So hopefully you can make it. It's free, as with a lot of open source things. So check that out. Let's see. I think that was all, but we would, of course, really like to thank Travis for coming and talking to us about Rook. Travis, is there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to kind of slip in there before we go?
Yeah, maybe I'll throw out there that with KubeCons, hopefully we're doing them in person going forward again. I'm looking forward to that. We always have a Rook booth there, so if anybody's at KubeCon, be happy to meet you and talk to you at the Rook booth. Is the easiest place to find, and there's always Rook talks at that conference as well. So looking forward to meeting people.
To Detroit in October,
yes,
that should be fun. I will also be there. Actually, we're going to be running a Kubernetes by example Insider day, maybe, or we're going to definitely kind of walk the floors and try to interview people. So we'll definitely be there and involved as well. But yeah, thanks so much again for your time, and we really appreciate it. Savitha, did you want to add anything else?
No, this has been an amazing session, Travis. I was like, I learned a lot, and I hope all the viewers, the community learned a lot from listening to today's episode. And thank you again for being here, taking your time and chatting with us about Rook and storage and Ceph. And yeah, definitely simplified some topics, at least for me. And I hope it's going to benefit everyone outside. So thank you for that. And I don't have anything else to add. I'm a big fan, so I'm like in awe. I was just listening to both of you talk. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that note, thanks again, Travis. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to the I think it was Brazil Linux Sips. And maybe we'll see you at the big Brazilian open source conference, which I'm blanking on the name of. I know a bunch of my friends regularly speak there, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks again for coming. Remember, we're on the last Tuesday of the month, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.